On my immediate left, we have Jonas von Freiesleben, who is a senior research analyst at the Center for UN Reform Education, and not surprisingly, he writes on Security Council reform. He was previously assistant attaché at the Danish mission to the United Nations, and then a researcher at Amnesty International in Copenhagen. And to his left, we have he's our wonderful alum. His real one of his many distinctions in our views, Jeffrey Laurenti, who is the Director of Foreign Policy Programs and a Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation here in New York. He was the Executive Director of Policy Studies at the UN Association of the United States till 2003. He's still on that association's board of directors, and he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. For many of you fortunate enough, as I am, to be on Jeff's op-ed or writings distribution list, he keeps you awake and always gives you something to think about. So I'm going to ask Jonas Freiesleben to start, but before I do, I just want to say, given that this is the lunchtime session, that we have ensured that we've kept the panel on which we expect a very lively debate for this hour. As we heard in the first panel this morning, there are many who think that the UN and member governments have been talking about Security Council reform for decades, and nothing is ever going to happen, and we should just let it go or leave it to an open-ended committee. And then there are those, and their voices are increasing, and I told you earlier I count myself as one, who think that if we are not successful in coming up with some kind of Security Council reform, then what we will see is the increasing marginalization of the United Nations on many important issues, because as we heard this morning, many countries already feel that the United Nations is non-representative. As Asia rises, Africa rises, Latin America rises, these are all countries that are not represented permanently on the Security Council. They will look at the United Nations and say, it is the United Nations of 1945. It is not the United Nations of the 21st century. So that, from that perspective, something must be done, and the question is always, what? So, Jonas von Freiesleben.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I want to thank Slaughter and Professor Slaughter and the Woodrow Wilson School and Princeton University for the invitation and for hosting this very timely and important event. As Professor Slaughter so kindly noted, I represent the Center for UN Reform Education, which is an independent, nonpartisan research organization located here in New York City. Since 1978, we've been researching and disseminating proposals to change structures of the UN through our books, panels, and analysis. And as we are nonpartisan, we do not endorse any particular reform proposals. I guess I just briefly want to touch upon the history of Security Council reform today, and how we got to where we are today, where we're headed, and what we should ask ourselves before reforming the Council. Attempts to change the structure and working methods of the Security Council are by no means new. It was already heatedly discussed at the San Francisco conference in '45. The first concrete Security Council reform proposals were tabled as early as the '50s. And then in '65, the first major change was adopted, expanding the number of non-permanent seats from 6 to 10. And I should briefly mention that to add new members to the Security Council, the Charter of the UN has to be amended. Under Article 108, a charter revision is a two-stage process. First, 2/3 of the entire General Assembly must approve a resolution to amend the charter. Then, 2/3 of the member states, including all of the permanent members of the Security Council, must ratify the amendment within an agreed-upon time frame. So it's a pretty complicated affair, and one that ultimately could be blocked by the permanent members. Although in large part the reform grew out of the reform in '65 grew out of a desire to accommodate the many newly independent African and Asian countries, it failed to completely satisfy the rapidly growing UN membership. The matter continued to be the subject of debate until India and other non-aligned countries tabled it in the General Assembly again in '79. This time, however, reform efforts were primarily blocked by the contentious Cold War dynamics at the UN. And it would take another 14 years and the fall of the Eastern Bloc for the issue to resurface. In '93, led by the aspirations of India, Japan, and Germany mainly, helped establish a working group of the General Assembly tasked with considering Security Council reform. And that's the open-ended working group that we still have today. It soon became apparent that discussions about expanding the Council had the instant ability to make regional rivalries flare up. For the most part, large or powerful countries that were not already permanent members of the Council favored the inclusion of new permanent members, mainly themselves, while their regional rivals preferred adding more non-permanent seats. As a result, the debate in the working group quickly grew into a bitter stalemate between three main interest groups that would hamper efforts pretty much until today. In general, three major interest groups, three major groups with variations and ad hoc modifications have so far played the major roles. And they are, first, the group of four, consisting of Germany, also the G4, consisting of Germany, India, Brazil, and Japan. And they seek permanent membership for themselves, usually without the veto, at least for the first 10 to 15 years. Then we have the Uniting for Consensus. Its membership varies, but they usually consist of Italy, Pakistan, Argentina, South Korea, Spain, and Mexico. So the G4's regional rivals. They oppose new permanent seats and instead seek a solution based on a regional model, a rotational model. And then finally we have the African countries. They seek 2 permanent seats for Africa with the right of veto per the so-called Essolvini Consensus. Expansion of the Security Council is only one aspect of reform, and I just very, very briefly want to touch on another important aspect, the independent process towards a reform of the working methods of the Security Council. It was initiated by a group of small countries in the 90s and more interested in transparent decision-making and easy access to permanent members than in the struggle for seats. So far, they, in tandem with some of the council members, permanent members, have managed to push the council to change their procedures in regard to issues dealing with transparency, the council's relationship with troop-contributing countries, sanctions committee, the overall UN membership, the General Assembly, and civil society. It's another aspect, and it's not the focus of today's discussion, but I just briefly wanted also to mention that that is also Security Council reform. In any case, until the beginning of the last General Assembly session, the debates in the working group had centered on the basis on which to conduct negotiations, so not actual makeup of a reformed Security Council. And during the last session that just ended a few weeks ago, an agreement was reached in the working group mandating member states to begin intergovernmental negotiations, which is actual negotiations on the composition of a future reform council in a plenary session of the General Assembly. Here, in the General Assembly, decisions can be made by a majority vote, contrary to the traditions of the usually consensus working group. And they have to start no later than February 2009. I'm sure that the ambassador, who I hope will come later, will tell you more about the significance of this move. But I just want to touch on what seems to be the preferred way forward at the moment, what they're talking about now. It's a so-called intermediate or interim also called timeline approach, where member states would agree to reform now, change the charter, and in 10 or 15 years have a conference to review the changes and possibly redo them. Many member states currently support this model as a way to break the deadlock, especially Germany, Brazil, and Japan. And I won't delve into India's position. Suffice it to say that they haven't seemed to have been completely won over by this model, but they're going along with it at the moment. And I'm sure Ambassador Sen will also talk on this. From a legal standpoint, an intermediate model is perfectly doable. There's nothing in the charter that prevents them from doing this. However, it might also be a dangerous road to head down. If you don't like it, return it. It sounds very nice and it sounds very simple. And it's actually happened once before in 1945. They decided to have a general review conference after 10 years, but it never happened. It was mainly to pacify skeptical countries to enter the UN Charter. So changing the Charter back and forth is not that easy, and an intermediate model might suddenly spell into a permanent solution. What would happen if member states decided to discontinue reforms and return to a 1945 version of the Charter? Would new member states accept that? Would new permanent members of the Security Council accept that? Voluntarily leave the Council again? What would happen if a review conference fails to happen? The skeptical members today, what would they feel? Finally, I just want to flag also some important questions that also need to be resolved before reform can continue, if we're not just to reproduce the ills of the current Council. I guess we have to also, at the moment, ask ourselves, new permanent members or regional rotating model, what model do we want? Do we want to give new members veto or without? Who would be new permanent members in that council? What should we use as a criteria? Should it be size of country, money, military might, geography, potential on the world scene, the voice in the world now? How should we be able to get rid, or if you should we be able to get rid of permanent members again once they're on? And I guess also importantly, what should a future council be able to do? We've talked about the responsibility to protect. Should we move in that direction, more intervention or towards development? And we also have to think about the structure and composition of a reform council again. Efficiency versus legitimacy. What's the maximum size for an efficient running council? What's more important, efficiency or legitimacy? One could argue that democracy is not always the most efficient, but I would say, in my personal opinion, that it's by far the most legitimate form of governing. With a large council, some have talked about 22 members as a maximum size, others talk about something bigger. There's definitely a danger that it'll be the lowest common denominator if we enlarge it. So I guess also another very important question, I just have a few, voting in a reform council. It takes now 9 affirmative votes to pass a resolution. What will it be? What will the cutoff on a reform council be? This is very important because it could seriously undermine the current permanent members' power and their wish to reform the council also. So that has to be dealt with. And should new permanent members get the same powers as current permanent members? Currently, the permanent members, the permanent 5, sit on various boards across the UN. They get to appoint high-level senior officials, judges at the International Court of Justice. They have a big say over the Bretton Woods institutions. A council reform could change the entire dynamics of the United Nations, for instance, by moving the organization towards development-related activities and less peace and security. So do we want new permanent members to have these rights? It's the heart of the organization that we're tinkering with. And I'm not saying that a reform isn't merited. Perhaps it is, if you want to have a more legitimate, modern, and representative council that can command universal respect. I guess all I'm saying is, and what I will end up saying here, that we have to get a reform right the first time. So we have to be in agreement, and we have to answer these important questions before we can start reforming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we welcome Ambassador Sen. We're very glad you could be with us. We will give you a minute to reflect and let Jeffrey Laurenti speak next, and then I will introduce the ambassador.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Don't we have a wonderful dean of the Woodrow Wilson School? I mean,
Hayden.
No, those of you who either are alumni or have otherwise been coerced into contributing to support the school, this is a matter of night and day in terms of the sun and the light that shines through that school now, especially in the arena of international affairs. And it's not because I want to be invited back to other Princeton events, but it's something that I think those of us who have watched the school over many years have felt that we have someone extraordinarily special whom we have to have mixed feelings about the thought of being perhaps summoned to even broader acres in the future. Anne-Marie had asked me, knowing that we would be talking in that deadly post-prandial period, to be insightful, I-N-C-I-T-E-F-U-L. That is provocative, to stir a pot. And Ambassador Sen, I am glad that you came in just in time, because I think that we're going to set up a lively debate here. We've been given the provocative question whether how you set up, how you make up, how you structure the Security Council, whether that has any relevance at all to the outcomes that come out of that Security Council. And I think Jonas put it right. We only are going to have one bite at this apple in terms of getting Security Council revision. Either we get it right and have a Security Council that is automatically self-adjusting, self-correcting, so that you don't have to keep revisiting it half a century or a full century from now, or we may end up making it worse. What is it that ails the Security Council? Is it its size? Is it too small to take action in a security emergency and expect the other 178 member states to go along with its decisions? If the Security Council had 25 members, would the other 168 feel that its decisions were any more binding or legitimate? I would answer no. Or is it that the current mix of elected members is unrepresentative of the broader international community? Possibly, but the allocation of those 10 is actually fairly representative of the member states in the total membership. Or is it the permanent members who effectively control the agenda, who meet among themselves, decide what the resolutions will be that they're ready to vote on, then invite the elected 10 in to nibble at the edges, perhaps, offer their views? And is it, as Jonas says, that the P5 represents yesterday's world, or the day before yesterday's world, fluctuating power levels, frozen in amber, that lock us into a different set of power relationships, regardless of whether those permanent members contribute a single soldier to UN peace operations or not? Or perhaps more specifically, is what ails the Council the veto in the hands of those 5? The Princeton Project on National Security, of which our dean was a co-director, was, I thought, very astute in arguing quite against the grain of the past quarter century's Washington conventional wisdom, that in fact abolition of the veto, replacement of it with a more flexible system of power-weighted voting, would in fact be much more important for the Council's effectiveness than rearranging the furniture around the Security Council table. Not that the furniture shouldn't be rearranged somewhat, but that points to the heart of what immobilizes the Council in emergencies. It is the veto, in its current form, that leads people to propose all kinds of cockamamie schemes to try to circumvent the Security Council, like Pat Robertson's idea of a League of Democracies that occasionally raises its ugly head in even this year's American presidential colloquy. For the United States, the so-called majority leader, if you can use that concept, that more than any other state takes the responsibility and has the unique ability to marshal majorities to take action in crises and to deliver the goods behind the nominal action of a Security Council resolution, to deliver the troops, the civilian staff, and yes, the dollars. After those decisions have been made, is it in the interests of the United States as a majority leader to take a different kind of structure that either enlarges it or adds a different mix of states? That's something that Americans have to consider. And on that question of the veto, let's face it, there is but one issue on which the United States has recurrent resort to the veto, and that's Israel-Palestine. With that resolved, and Ehud Olmert gives us some sense that there are new possibilities emerging among the sides in that dispute. We're not as far off as in the past. The U.S. clinging to the veto as it has always been may become much less a feature of immovable American politics. The concerns that the U.S. should have in looking at Security Council revision would include, one, tilting the balance. that same Western overrepresentation that triggers the rising challenges to the Council's, quote, legitimacy is what the U.S., as the Council's effective majority leader, has found indispensable in forging working majorities for action. Expansion that tilts the membership significantly in the direction of the G77 could put the U.S. skill and ability at coalition building at risk. We should have no illusions about democratic solidarity. Our friends in India, our friends in Indonesia, our friends in the developing country democracies tend to view the world through the lens of being developing countries, much more than through a so-called democratic solidarity. And that is something that people should not be naive about. Second, size matters. The Security Council is often called upon to act quickly in a crisis, and even at 15, it is often hard-pressed to do so quickly. During the Clinton years, the U.S. had laid down a core principle on Security Council revision: no more than 20 members. Well, maybe 21, but no more than that. And then permanence. Part of the current P5's crisis of legitimacy is that fluctuation of countries' relative power resources over time. While current contenders for permanent seats may today be aligned with U.S. interests, or they may today make significant contributions to peace and security operations, once they have their seat, they can stop making those contributions, and if they're permanent, nothing happens. Look at the existing 5 permanent members, and you will see that at least some do not participate in UN peace operations. And think that you can reproduce that as soon as others get their permanency. Moreover, if you have an Abacha coming back in Nigeria, you get a Chavez type in Brazil, the United States would have real questions about why these countries should be locked in permanently on the Council. But of course, the U.S. does have strong reasons of bilateral interests with some countries to support those major allies' claims. I think it's significant to note that when Kofi Annan's high-level panel in 2004 took up this issue and tried to link the Security Council structure to its outcomes, that its conclusion was, yes, there's a concern about long-term legitimacy. Second, there is even more urgently a concern about linking frequency or unelected status on the Council even to measurable, quantifiable contributions to peace and security. And that panel initially was producing one recommendation, which became known later as Model B, when after protests from those who saw themselves as at least as important as Britain or France, insisted that a rotating model of the major countries in each region having frequent longer-term access to the Council was insufficient, that you then had a Model A or Model T, if you will, of expanding the ranks of permanent members. Now, this is an issue on which I think the United States in particular has a deep interest, and it's an interest that is fundamentally one of having a Council that works well, and that is flexible enough for the long-term future that you're not going to make a bad situation, if the problem is the permanent members that we already have, worse. And for that reason, I think that we all have a stake in looking for a solution that incorporates greater flexibility, incorporates an appreciation of power contributions to the Council, and yet maximizes the opportunity to be able to throw overboard a claimant that no longer produces, that no longer delivers the goods. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will introduce Ambassador Sen. Let me just say, because it is on the record and I want there to be no mistake, that the Princeton Project on National Security recommended the abolition of the veto on resolutions requiring direct action. In other words, not on censure resolutions, but on resolutions requiring some kind of sanctions or other direct action. I just want to be very clear on that particular subject. So Ambassador Nirupam Sen, is India's permanent representative to the United Nations. He's a distinguished member of the Indian Foreign Service. He's previously served as India's High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, and he's headed Indian missions in Sofia, and Oslo. So we are delighted to have him with us. Ambassador Sen.
Thank you. The Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, Dr. Ms. Anne Mary Slaughter, Stephen Barnes, members of the panel, distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen. I'm indeed very happy to be here among you today. Let me begin by saying that I would like to look at basically two questions. I mean, they have been raised implicitly and even directly by Dr. Laurenti, which is that should the Security Council be reformed at all? If so, is it practicable to do it? If the answer is yes, then how do we do it? First of all, let me begin with the financial crisis itself, because I think that has a bearing on what I would like to urge. The financial crisis, as we know, is very acute. The masters of the universe and Wall Street have all bit the dust, and we now realize that we all have the same dust in our mouths and the same war at our gates. Now, the thing is this, that this crisis has had a profound impact on the poorer sections, not just in the South, but equally in the North. In the South, of course, you have a serious problem in terms of lack of equity, debt capital, which is halting many projects, falling commodity prices and the like. Now, this crisis was truly a result, on the one hand, possibly of some greed, because the Bible says that those who live by the sword die by the sword, and those who live by investment banking die by investment banking. So I think, so that is one aspect of it. But the other, surely, is complete deregulation. Now, it is the Bretton Woods institutions who, on the one hand, didn't bother to advise on regulation here, and on the other, advised the developing countries to actually liberalize capital markets. Now, this was the light that we were asked to follow. This was the model that we were asked to adopt. Fortunately, we didn't, because had we done that, the crisis would have been a world catastrophe. So now the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF in particular, have admitted they were wrong on deregulation, they were wrong on capital markets liberalization, and I would say they were also wrong on structural adjustment. So in other words, they have been absolutely helpless and irrelevant to the crisis. And this is no wonder, because when they were set up at the same time as the Security Council, and both were set up with a bit of gerrymandering. Now, it's interesting that Dr. Anne Mary Slaughter is here, because I think it is the Princeton University that has published Raymond Mixell's The Bretton Woods Debates, a memoir. Raymond Mixell worked under Harry White, and he has said it in black and white, that he was asked really to arrive at predetermined quotas, to actually juggle and manipulate statistics and play with weights in order to ensure the permanent dominance. So how can you, and the Security Council was set up in pretty much the same way. Now, how can you expect organizations that set up with such gerrymandering not to be exhausted in 60 years? And they are truly exhausted. So therefore, it is important that unless we all want to follow the motto of the Manchester School, which incidentally was not written by any radical, but by Benjamin Disraeli, a pillar of the Tory establishment, who said that peace and plenty amid starving peoples and the world in arms. So therefore, unless we want to do that, we would have to be proactive and make the Security Council relevant and effective. Unless it becomes as irrelevant, if we do not do that, it will become as irrelevant as the Bretton Woods institutions. So I think the world has changed. There's clearly a case for doing that. Second, we are moving, as all of us know, from a Westphalia model to a human rights-centered approach. Hence this development of the concept of the responsibility to protect. Now today, if we want to, have a situation where the responsibility can be exercised in an ultimate sense, where everything else fails, through some use of minimal force, then in that case you cannot avoid both comprehensively altering the Charter, amending the Charter, and reforming the Security Council. Because in the terms of the present Charter, the Security Council has absolutely no business to do anything in terms of human rights or responsibility to protect. Because in terms of the Charter, it is not a judge, it is a policeman. It is meant to simply tackle immediate threats to international peace and security. It's a firefighter. And clearly, even if, let us say, there is a country that has violated international humanitarian law and legal obligations, but is not a threat to peace and security, there's nothing that the Security Council legally can do anything about it. It may stretch the definition of peace and security, which is again anti-charter, to try to bring such a country onto the agenda. But in terms strictly of the charter, it is not meant to do anything in this respect. That is one aspect. The second is that in any case, even if it stretches the definition of peace and security, a threat to peace and security, and wants to do something, the problem is that its political basis is too narrow. So it is not just a question of whether it is representative or not. The power basis of the Permanent Five, the political basis is too narrow for it to be legitimately seen to be really exercising the responsibility to protect, quite apart from the fact that there is no such thing as due process of law in its deliberations. Its decisions are not subject to judicial review, which both in the United States and India we know is a fundamental tenet of any kind of democratic action. Even the International Court of Justice cannot really review its decisions. So therefore, it may do so in some cases, which are contentious proceedings, the doctrine of lithi pandas, where it cannot do that as a rule. So I think these are some of the things which make it very necessary both for democratic countries to be brought into permanent membership, and also it makes it necessary to expand this very narrow political basis so that the Security Council is able to act. Now, one can see, even if you look at certain other aspects of this issue, for instance, the International Court of Justice. Now, the Security Council is not able, now, the point I mentioned about its job to ensure immediate peace and security. The thing is that this question of immediate peace and security, instead of, which means that it has a discretion to do that, it argues in legal terms a varying commitment to collective security, which is totally at loggerheads with the consistent defense and consistent protection of human rights, which is the essence of the responsibility to protect. So it simply does not have the political base. It does not have the kind of impartiality that would come from a wider and more optimal composition of the permanent membership to really act on humanitarian concerns. Quite apart from the charter point I mentioned, that it is a fine system of collective security and it is not meant as an instrument for implementing international human rights law or humanitarian law. So therefore, it is necessary to do this. Then you look at the most important aspect of the UN's work today in this aspect of peace and security, that is in Security Council, which is UN peacekeeping. Now, in terms of UN peacekeeping also, the deployment of soldiers is something that is very crucial. And this deployment, if it is seen that this deployment comes from the victors of World War II, that these soldiers are simply the agents of the victors of World War II, then the basic objective, which is to have maximum enforcement strength with the minimum of force, cannot be achieved. And this actually is happening because the UN officers, for the first time, instead of being seen as symbols of protection, are becoming targets themselves. And this was really the conclusion of the Brahimi panel report. Brahimi, not the old panel on the peacekeeping, but the recent Brahimi report on the terrorist incidents in Algeria. So therefore, quite clearly, if you look at peacekeeping also, there is a clear case for widening the permanent membership to create a foundation for effective peacekeeping with the minimum of force. Stroop Talbot, in a very recent book, has made the point that if we are going to solve the gigantic problems of today or even address them effectively, then really we need to have multilateralism on a scale that has been undreamt of so far, certainly unimplemented so far. Now, for that, I would submit that the United States would need the United Nations under any circumstances for precisely this kind of multilateral mechanism to be used for objectives that advance the interests of mankind, and of course the national interests of the United States, which is quite legitimate. And for that, it would require friends, it would require allies, but it would require also those with the necessary financial and above all logistical and military capacity. And that is crucial. And it would require those who share values, that is democratic countries. Now, so far what has happened is that the Security Council today, the decisions are rather like the edicts, as I think Kishore Mehbubani once said, like the edicts of George III, that is legal but with eroding legitimacy. And to re-establish that legitimacy, you require a more optimal structure. Now here, apropos of what Dr. Laurenti said, see, on the question of small size and efficiency, the point is that size and efficiency are two different things. You know, the UN Security Council is not a business enterprise. It is not something that where you have to cut size and keep to. I'll conclude quickly. Where you have to keep to small numbers. It is essentially an organization where you cannot confuse you cannot go in for a conceptual confusion. That is of the decision-making machinery with the substance of decision-making. Because size, the numbers are only a mechanism, a machinery of decision-making. The substance of it is really what is important, which is that you require optimal decisions, which can come only if countries, let us say like India, Brazil, Japan, Germany, South Africa, were permanent members, because then you will have a more optimal decision-making, which will then minimize the use of force and will be more widely acceptable politically. So efficiency is that. It is not really science. And the final point I wanted to make is that if you look at even the ultimate opponent of this kind of a model, that is John Bolton. If you see his book, Surrender is Not an Option, on page 255, he says that most of the things that are done by the Security Council are done badly. They are not done well. If you look at page 344, he says that he says that in fact the problems of the world today are only massaged, not resolved. This is his phrase, not mine. They are massaged, not resolved. So actually, what he says establishes the case, which is the opposite of the case he wants to establish in what he proposes. Because you have the greatest opponent of Security Council reform actually making the most effective case for Security Council reform in actually what he has said. So therefore, the important thing is that we have reached a point, I would say, and this is a perfectly practical proposition. The President of the General Assembly finally has issued a note that we are going to have the intergovernmental negotiations for reforming it on November 21st, after a decision taken by the General Assembly on the 15th of September to actually have negotiations for the first time after 15 years to reform the Council. So that is there. So in other words, to conclude, I mean, we have to remember that, as Thucydides said, I mean, organizations begin to die if they do not expand. And you have Darwin also, that species begin to die if they do not adapt to their environment. And we are precisely in this situation that unless we really make the Security Council relevant to the present situation, it would go the way of the Bretton Woods institutions. And to adapt what Aimé Césaire said in quite a different context, I mean, an organization that cannot really solve the problems that it faces is a decaying organization. An organization that refuses to face up to these problems is a stricken organization. And an organization that uses technical trickery, some kind of rotating seats and so on, to solve things, is actually a dying organization. Because this is really technical trickery, what Model B of the high-level panel report was. This was tried out as early as 1926. You remember, rotating seats were given to a number of countries in the League of Nations, and the League of Nations collapsed. So I'm reminded of what Thomas Pynchon said in his last novel, that I'm surprised, it is rather late in the day it is late in the day, late in history for these to appear, given the dismal metonymies of the dead. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, given that it grows late in our session, I'm going to actually open the floor to questions. And instead of posing my own question to the panel, I'm going to put it out there and let them respond as they respond to some of you. We've had a very succinct overview of the issues. Dr. von Freiesleben laid out the history of UN reform. Ambassador Sen, you weren't here for that, but he noted that it really began pretty much in 1945 and in some form has been continuing ever since. Jeff Laurenti, of course, said it's not broken, so there's no need to fix it. And then we just heard a passionate rebuttal of that particular view. So let me open the floor. The one thing I would say is that to Ambassador Sen, he notes that in November there will be these intergovernmental negotiations, but if history is any guide, they will prove once again inconclusive. And the question then is, what is going to be the trigger that finally forces countries that are opposed to reform, but for whom the status quo is really on their side, to change their position? But the flip side of that view for Jeff Laurenti, and again, just think about this and as you're listening to other questions, is at what point, if the UN is increasingly circumvented, and that's what Ambassador Sen is saying, that it will be increasingly circumvented by regional organizations, by organizations like NATO, even by coalitions of the willing, at what point will the status quo no longer really seem viable? So I'm going to put those on the table and open the floor. Yes, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Rob Foreman, formerly of CBS for Life of Princeton. I get the sense, just listening to this, that the ultimate solution, the ultimate resolution, may not be a matter of intellectual honesty, or maybe that's the wrong word, but the optimal solution intellectually, but a product of good old-fashioned horse trading among the nations of the world. China has staked out a position in Africa that seems to improve its base for whatever it wants to do. But getting that out of the mix, what might be the currency of the horse trading that ultimately breaks the logjam? What does an India or Brazil have to offer those other than intellectual arguments to bring this about?
Ambassador Sen, I think that one may be for you.
Okay. I'll try to... Should I come there or respond?
Yes. No, go ahead.
Okay.
You can respond right here.
Yeah. No, let me, thank you very much, Dr. Slaughter. No, let me respond both to what you said and what the gentleman just asked. You see, firstly, let me make it clear that no negotiations have ever been held in the history of the United Nations on the reform of the UN Security Council. Because what has happened is that since the open-ended working group was set up in 1991-92, there have been consultations. There have been consultations, but you see, negotiations in technical parlance in the UN is a different thing. Negotiations is when you have a text, you negotiate on it, there is a give and take, there's a compromise, and you come to a final solution. In this sense, there have never been negotiations in the UN. There have been only consultations in the open-ended working group, and the open-ended working group works by consensus. Now, which meant that a small minority was able to use the open-ended working group to prevent any movement on Security Council reform for 15 years. So therefore, the decision taken on the 15th of September by the UN General Assembly is truly path-breaking, because they cut the consultative function of the OEWG from the negotiating function of the UN, which has to be exercised by the plenary of the General Assembly. And they called for a plenary meeting on November 21st. So therefore, this will be the first time that actual negotiations are held. That is one. Second thing is, which relates to both the questions, is that in 2005, the G4, that is India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan, and their supporters and the African Union foreign minister struck a compromise in London known as the London Compromise. At that stage, you know, the G4 had about 100 supporters outside the African Union. With that compromise, at least 40 out of the 53 would have voted in favor. So we would have got well above a two-thirds majority. But at that time, a decision was taken by the G4 foreign ministers not to put the resolution to the vote. Of course, in retrospectively, very incorrectly. But this decision was taken because in all diplomacy, 100% of the time, this is the only exception that I know of, the heads of state do not say that our foreign ministers are foolish and should be, shunted aside. They normally, in all diplomatic conferences, the heads of state ultimately just give the imprimatur of approval to what the foreign ministers have done. But the African Union summit proved a major exception to this normal diplomatic practice. And therefore, when the summit took place, the compromise struck by the African Union foreign ministers was set aside. Now, once that happened, and the African Union was tied to an ironclad, inflexible regime with immediate giving of the veto to 2 African members and so on and so forth. Now, this made it impossible for us to win a vote because you would have got 100, maybe 110 votes, you would not have got 123. So after 2005, the matter could never be put to the vote. Now the question is that we have now finally this negotiations. Now, in the negotiations, what will happen is, why are the negotiations necessary? And what is their meaning? What will happen in the negotiations is that the African Union can no longer hide behind this compromise, can no longer either abstain or vote against. Each individual African Union member would have to engage in the negotiations, that what do they accept, what do they reject, what are they prepared to give, what are they prepared to take, the normal process of give and take of any negotiation in a multilateral forum. So once they do that, then let us say if 30 to 35 even or 40 members of the African Union then express those positions, then that basic, the inflexible straitjacket that was woven by the African Union summit will cease to exist. And then once again, a forward movement through a vote, a final status resolution would become possible. So that is the significance, and that is the process by which it is not horse trading as such. It is really the negotiating process and the impact of the negotiating process on the African Union that would bring once again the requisite majority required to reform the Security Council. I thank you.
Jeff, do you want to comment? Or
Well, yes. First, to make clear that I didn't say that the Security Council isn't broken. I was just suggesting that what ails the Security Council is this relic of 1945 of permanent members with vetoes, and that's what should be the real focus of reform. I would note that the African group in particular has traditionally had the view of complete equality among its members, great or small, and we see that in whom the African group puts on the Security Council. Every other region tends to, in the elected members, to elect frequently the largest, heavier weight members. The Africans have been quite adamant that everybody has to wait his turn. You go through the entire cycle. Cape Verde's, as much as Nigeria, has access to the council, and the habit of conviction there is frankly anathema to the sense that the Security Council needs to have a collection of members who can put their shoulder to the wheel after they make decisions and then make things happen. And that has always been the problem with what had been frankly, the preference for most member states. Just add elected members with no qualification at all, that you would get more of the smaller fry and you have a more unwieldy council. But I did just want to make that clear, Emery, that I'm not saying it ain't broke.
No, fair
but it's
point.
a different kind of diagnosis of the illness.
Do you want to add in?
I think on the question of what do they have to offer these new, I think it's a question that the permanent members also ask themselves all the time. What would new permanent members offer? And I think, unfortunately, the permanent members of today rarely come up with an answer that would satisfy reformers. Because, unfortunately, I think the permanent members of today don't really see any new permanent members able to offer anything new. There's just so much of the power cake. And by adding more permanent members, there'll just be less to eat. Unfortunately, I also agree that we need some sort of reform, but The problem is at the moment that the permanent members are looking at it too short-sighted. They know that the council is being increasingly marginalized, but they can't really do anything about it at the moment because they don't want to lose out. And it's this short-sightedness that's blocking the council at the moment, blocking Security Council reform at the moment.
Great. I see a number of more hands. Donna, you want to?
Donna Zulka, Princeton class of 76. This reminds me of a guest list to a wedding. The more people you invite, the more people are upset that they're not invited to be at the place. Would it be advisable, or if you have a problem in a region, to start immediately with the small Security Council, but within 24 hours to draw in the group of countries that were most affected by the problem that was occurring? For instance, the invasion of Georgia. Many of the European countries nearby should take part in decisions that a Security Council would have. A problem in Africa, you add very shortly, within the 24 hours, the countries that were involved around the country that had the problem. But you keep that Security Council small because then again, the larger you make it, the larger you're going to have to make it because more people will be upset. What nobody can have doesn't make as many unhappy people. That's just.
I love the image of the wedding. I'm going to actually give the microphone to Lee Feinstein. We'll get two questions and then let you respond.
The first is just a response to the page references that Ambassador Sen made in the former U.S. Perm Rep's book, which is to say, as you know, I mean that the irony of that position in the United States is that were one to create a more effective Security Council, that would be an even less desirable result from that ideological point of view. That's a consistent, by the way, ideological principle, and the principle is just that from an American perspective, a more credible Security Council constrains American freedom of action, and that's something that is opposed from, let's just say, a conservative point of view. So I just make that point. But I wanted to ask, and this is a question for probably at least two of you, what is required in the charter for extended memberships rather than new permanent memberships? Does that require an amendment, or is that something that could be done in another fashion? Because this is an idea that's being bandied about now.
What do you mean by extended memberships?
Longer terms, extended terms. So
it requires a charter amendment.
Yes,
Any of these does.
and I guess to Ambassador Sen. What do you think about that as a interim solution?
You know, the Security Council, once it has the discretion only to determine if a country's national interests are affected. And if they are, it has no further discretion to prevent its being present in the debates and discussions on the subject. So you already have that in the Charter. And while this rule is sometimes breached, no doubt, but very often it has been used quite fairly by the Security Council, and yet it has made no difference. So it is not a question, I would say, of involving those countries. The point is, it is a crisis of legitimacy, it is a crisis of resources, and a crisis of authority, without which you do not have optimal decisions, and these decisions are not really accepted. Because if you look at 1945, I mean, the question of veto was mentioned. Now, the veto was exercised by UK, France, and USSR on the basis of empires. All these empires have crumbled. And while no doubt nobody is denigrating the achievement of the victors of World War II, I mean, no doubt it was a mighty achievement to smash Nazism, and there's no question about it. But at the same time, it was an equally great achievement to make at least the possibility of human rights available to vast millions and millions of people in the world through the decolonization process. The anti-colonial struggles were equally important as the smashing of Nazism, and particularly Mahatma Gandhi's struggle, which empowered hundreds of millions of people and which is so rich with promise for the future of mankind. So for us it is difficult and it's totally unacceptable that the heirs of Mao Zedong and the heirs of the state set up by Joseph Stalin should be on the council and the heirs of Gandhi should not be. And in any case, the main point about the council is that you see that John Bolton's book, I agree that John Bolton's logic probably is that the council is bad, and that suits us fine, and therefore it shouldn't be reformed. I grant your point. But nevertheless, I would still maintain that I would draw the opposite conclusion, which I did earlier, that the council is bad, and therefore it needs to be reformed, because it's not able to take care of the problems of the world today. It's a bit like, it reminds me of the poem of the 18th century poet John Dryden, who said that all of a piece throughout, thy chase had a beast in view, thy wars brought nothing about, thy lovers were all untrue. So 'tis well in old age is out and time to begin anew. Now, on your other question of extended membership, see, the point is that an extended membership would be like reform for the sake of reform, art for art's sake, because it will not really tackle the real problems that we face, which can only be done by expanding the permanent membership and by introducing into their midst the principle of election. That is, permanent members that would be elected by the General Assembly, and then the principle of accountability, that those permanent members would be held accountable through a review process. Because only then can we tackle the real problems that exist. Otherwise, you will only make the council unwieldy without making it effective, because it would not tackle any of the essential issues. And that briefly would be my response. I thank you.
Thank you.
Well, a question, Ambassador Sen. How flexible are India and its partners on the question of entering a council without, once they're elected to it, never having to face election, without a veto? That is, are you prepared to do this without a veto? And then, given how the council works, are you then put into a second circle of hell outside, while the inner five that still have the veto really still cut up the pie? How would that work?
Well, my answer to that would be, Dr. Laurenti, that you see, the thing is that our position in the G4 was in fact a flexible position, more or less on the lines of what you're saying. That is, that we said that the principle of the veto should be extended to new permanent members, but the exercise thereof should be postponed to a review conference after 10 to 15 years. So we were not planning to immediately claim exercise of the veto. And the reason for that is, one, because I think the veto is something which I agree with you 100%, is an institution that needs to be drastically reformed. But it cannot be reformed by any other means except through a transformation of the permanent membership and by changing the political culture of the use of the veto. Because the essential strength of what you do comes not just from the veto, it comes from an institutional memory which comes from permanent membership. Because one of the reasons, and I entirely share your phrase, why the non-permanent members are furniture, is simply because they do not have the institutional memory. They come and go. 2 years, one person, then another, and so on. But at the same time, I would be prepared to go further than my colleagues in the G4 and accept a process of regular reviews. In other words, to take care of the problem you mentioned. That let's say some unforeseen event comes and a country that is a permanent member has some very strange things happening in it. In that case, surely there should be the possibility of a review. So I would say that, and that will also help in the case of accountability, of holding the permanent members accountable to changing the working methods, to changing the political culture. So for that, I think you need a review maybe after every 10 years, or if that is too short, after every 15 years, a review process to take care of that and also to ensure accountability.
Dr. Freiesleben, you have the last word because we're almost at 2 o'clock, and I will try to summarize.
Yeah, I guess with the suggestion from the floor about a small council, then join it together or draw a group around it together. I guess the problem rises again. Then that'll be another wedding invitation, and who gets to invite and who gets to come. I think definitely. They're looking at it at the moment with the working methods. How can we make it more representative? How can we have more actors, also non-state actors, represented in the council? How can they come to the council and brief them? So they're working at that. I guess also with the requirement for extended membership, of course it requires amending the charter and that's a difficult process. But it's a fairly easy thing they could do. They could just take out one line, and now I forget what article it is, but they could just take out the line saying that non-permanent members cannot stand for immediate re-election, and then they would actually solve that problem. So that is a fairly easy question. Lastly, I guess I just want to say that the real problem of the Security Council, as I also see it, usually tends to revolve around the member states themselves. And in my introduction, I expressed serious doubt about a review process and a review conference and how doable it actually would be. So I guess I just have a question for Ambassador Sen. I know we don't have time, but why not just have elections then instead of this whole idea of a review conference?
No, the elections basically deprive you of the fundamental historical memory, institutional memory that you have. A review conference is based on actually reviewing your performance in the whole General Assembly. And in case that performance is such that it merits a censor, then censoring it. And if you're reviewing the performance of newly elected permanent members, you cannot avoid looking at the performance of the permanent members also. And that is how political culture changes. Whereas if you simply have an election process, then instead of 2 years, let's say a person is there for 4 years or a country is there for 4 years, it doesn't change anything.
Thank you. That last suggestion I don't think is going to endear this process anymore to the United States, but I certainly take the point. But as I listen to this debate, it does strike me that there's an even more fundamental issue at stake in what Ambassador Sen is proposing, which is the United Nations actually capable of any kind of change to respond to what everyone agrees is a very different security environment? And part of this, the Security Council in many ways stands for the proposition, well, it talks and talks and talks, but nothing ever happens, which is not fair to the United Nations at all. The United Nations does many things and has changed in various ways, but in many ways, movement on this issue could herald the ability of the United Nations to adapt to many different circumstances. The U.S. Constitution is hard to amend as well, but we have succeeded in amending it almost 30 times. It can be done. When the requirement is there, that actually happens. So in many ways, I think what we're looking at is two quite divergent paths for the collective security of the 21st century. One is that the crisis that we're living through right now in the financial sector, the crises we've already had with respect to terrorism, the crisis that we hope we avoid with respect to global epidemics, but nevertheless, as we heard this morning, could strike any day. The increasing evidence of climate change, and not simply the weather, but the security problems that are already and will continually increase as the results of climate change. As spreading desertification, rising sea levels will trigger migrations. Those migrations will trigger the oldest kinds of conflicts in the book, people leaving their land and trying to take other land. In the face of all those crises, we will either see a recognition that something has to give. It's not a perfect solution, whether it's 4 members, whether it's Plan B, but something has to give. And then you will see a rolling process of reform for the UN, for the Bretton Woods institutions, for the G8, for the WTO. There's no shortage of institutions to be reformed. Or, I fear, you will see stasis for 10 to 15 years until the global map has been redrawn in such a way that fundamentally you have new powers creating new institutions and the older powers either responding or turning to institutions of their own. That is a much more fragmented image of the 21st century. It is an image that, in my view, does not promote collective security. And speaking personally, I very much hope that we can find a way to improve the collective security ideals that were embodied first in the League and then in the United Nations and take them forward into the 21st century. Before I close, I would like to ask you to give a round of applause to Steve Barnes and Rebecca Anderson in the back of the room who have made this day They are masters at putting this kind of event together and ensuring that we have a lively discussion and really a conversation. I'd like to thank all of you and give a hand to our wonderful final panel. Thank you.
You